Expedition Bigfoot has spent every season going further into the most remote wilderness corridors in North America than any prior Bigfoot investigation has been willing to go. They have documented thermal evidence, physical trace evidence, and acoustic recordings that the scientific community has never adequately addressed. But nothing in the show's prior history prepared the team for what approached them in the dark during this investigation. They did not finish the session. They left. And the footage captured before they did changes everything. Subscribe and stay until the end. Expedition Bigfoot occupies a specific and important position in the landscape of cryptid documentary television that distinguishes it from every comparable production operating in the same genre space. The paranormal and cryptid television market has never been short of content. The cable landscape has sustained an unbroken stream of Bigfoot-adjacent programming across multiple decades, ranging from the credible to the theatrical, whose collective effect on the public understanding of the evidence has been to dilute the serious research record with enough manufactured drama and ambiguous footage that the genuinely significant findings have difficulty being received with the weight they deserve. Expedition Bigfoot was built in deliberate opposition to that dilution. The show's foundational premise is that the evidence for a large, unknown bipedal primate in North American forest environments is substantial enough to warrant a research approach whose methodology reflects that substantiality. Not trail cameras positioned along popular hiking corridors, not investigators reacting to ambiguous sounds in the dark, but a systematic, technology-driven, scientifically grounded investigation conducted in the locations where the evidence is most concentrated, and by a team whose combined expertise gives the research operation credibility that the genre has historically struggled to claim. Ronnie LeBlanc's investigative background and his sustained personal engagement with the evidence base across years of independent research before the production began gives the show an investigative anchor whose knowledge of the prior evidence record goes deeper than any comparable presenter in the cryptid television space. Dr. Maria Mayer's academic background as a primatologist and field researcher brings a scientific framework to the investigation that most paranormal productions conspicuously lack. The methodology of a working biologist applied to evidence whose significance her professional training gives her the tools to assess with a precision that general investigators cannot match. The combination of those two figures, supported by a research and technical team whose fieldwork capability extends the investigation's reach into terrain and conditions that standard documentary productions cannot access, has produced across the show's seasons the most credible body of documented Bigfoot field research ever captured for broadcast television. What the team encountered during the investigation that produced the footage, this video documents exceeded everything that prior credibility had prepared them for, and the footage they captured before they left is the reason this video exists. The specific location where the Expedition Bigfoot team conducted the investigation that ended in a full team departure was not selected through the standard development process that drives most television production location choices. It was selected at the end of a research process whose depth and rigor reflected the production's commitment to operating in the locations where the evidence was most concentrated, rather than in the locations that were most accessible or most visually suited to the documentary format. The location selection process for this investigation drew on 3 independent bodies of evidence that converged on the same geographic area from different research directions. The first was the physical evidence record, the accumulation of track castings, biological samples, and structural evidence from the area that the prior field research literature had documented across a span of decades without any systematic investigation having followed up on the individual findings comprehensively. The track castings from this area showed the dermal ridge detail and the anatomical proportions that the forensic literature on physical Bigfoot evidence identifies as markers of genuine biological impressions, and they were distributed across the area in a pattern consistent with a resident population whose territorial range centered on the specific drainage system the production identified as its primary investigation zone. The second body of evidence was the acoustic record. Recordings produced by independent researchers working the area across the prior decade documented vocalizations in the frequency ranges associated with large primate communication that the standard biological reference for the region's wildlife could not account for. The frequency analysis of those recordings, conducted by an audio specialist whose professional background in acoustic analysis was unconnected to cryptozoological research, produced findings consistent with a vocal apparatus significantly larger than any known North American animal species and carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization in the region. The third body of evidence was the witness testimony, the accumulation of independent encounter reports from hunters, forestry workers, and outdoor recreation users whose accounts of the area were consistent across independent observations, separated by years of time, and whose descriptions of what they had seen, heard, and physically encountered were detailed enough and specific enough to indicate genuine observation rather than the generalized impressions that misidentification produces. The convergence of those three independent evidence streams on the same geographic area is what the production identified as the most significant location indicator in the show's research history. It was the most evidentially supported single location the show had ever targeted for a full investigation deployment, and what that deployment produced exceeded everything the prior evidence record had suggested would be waiting there. The Expedition Bigfoot team arrived at the investigation location with the full weight of the production's technical capability deployed. The thermal imaging infrastructure, the acoustic monitoring network, the track documentation equipment, and the biological sample collection resources that the show's prior seasons had developed into the most sophisticated Bigfoot field investigation toolkit in the history of organized research into the phenomenon. The deployment methodology reflected the lessons the prior seasons had accumulated about how the subject behaved in relation to investigation activity, the awareness of human presence that the prior field evidence consistently indicated, the behavioral sophistication that the track pattern analysis and the acoustic record suggested, and the specific environmental conditions under which encounter probability was highest based on the accumulated field data. The baseline documentation conducted across the investigation's initial phase established an environmental profile for the target zone that the technical team's field notes describe as unlike anything the prior season's investigation deployments had produced. The acoustic sensors logged vocalizations in the infrasound range within the first hours of the deployment that the production's audio specialist identified as structural, not random low-frequency noise but organized sound whose internal patterning was consistent with communication rather than incidental environmental production. The thermal cameras covering the perimeter of the camp logged the first anomalous heat signatures at the edge of the tree line before the team had completed their initial site assessment. Signatures whose dimensions and movement characteristics the operator flagged in real time as inconsistent with any animal in the biological reference database for the region. The track documentation team working the creek drainage adjacent to the primary camp position found fresh evidence of activity in the soft ground along the bank whose characteristics, the size, the stride pattern, the pressure distribution, were consistent with the physical evidence record that had driven the location selection, and whose freshness indicated that whatever had produced it had been in the area within hours of the team's arrival. The subject of the investigation knew the team was there before the team had finished setting up, and the signs it was producing in response to their presence were not the incidental byproducts of an animal going about its ordinary activity. They were deliberate, they were directed, and they were escalating. The investigation's night sessions are the operational core of the Expedition Bigfoot methodology, the periods when the thermal imaging capability is most relevant, when the acoustic monitoring is most productive, and when the behavioral evidence from the prior field research suggests encounter probability is highest. The night session that produced the footage this video documents began with the same systematic deployment the production's prior seasons had established as standard procedure. Thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridors, acoustic sensors running across the full frequency spectrum, the team positioned at the locations the prior day's evidence collection had identified as the most active zones of the investigation area. The first hour of the session produced evidence in every instrument category that the technical team's field notes describe as the most concentrated body of simultaneous anomalous readings any single Expedition Bigfoot investigation session had previously generated. The acoustic sensors logged a progression of vocalizations beginning at the perimeter of the investigation area and moving systematically closer across the first 40 minutes of the session, a progression whose directional consistency and whose escalating proximity the audio specialist documented as indicating deliberate movement toward the team's position rather than the random distribution of an animal moving through its territory. The thermal cameras confirmed the directional movement the acoustic data was tracking. Heat signatures at the tree line, initially at the outer range of the camera's resolution capability, then progressively closer as the session advanced, moved with the purposeful, fluid locomotion that the prior season's encounter footage had established as the thermal signature of the subject. The investigation was deployed to document. The ground was soft enough in the primary approach corridor to preserve the physical trace of the movement the cameras were tracking, and the track documentation equipment running in that corridor logged impressions whose freshness and whose anatomical detail gave the investigation a real-time physical record of the subject's approach that the prior seasons had never achieved simultaneously with active thermal and acoustic documentation. Everything was aligned. Every instrument category was producing consistent, corroborating data. The investigation was performing exactly as the methodology had been designed to perform. And then, at the 51-minute mark of the session, the data changed in a way that the methodology had not been designed to account for. The change in the investigation data at the 51-minute mark of the night session is the pivot point of the banned episode footage and the specific development whose character produced the team's departure decision. The thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridor had been tracking movement at the tree line for 40 minutes, movement whose proximity had been increasing incrementally across that period in a pattern consistent with a subject methodically closing the distance between itself and the investigation team's position. At 51 minutes, the incremental pattern ended. The thermal signature that had been approaching from the tree line was no longer at the tree line. The camera covering the primary approach corridor registered its presence at a distance from the team's position that the 40 minutes of incremental approach had not prepared anyone monitoring the data to expect. The distance had collapsed in a single movement whose speed the camera's frame rate captured without any intermediate frames showing the transition, present at the tree line in one frame, present at the investigation team's position in the next. The acoustic sensors logged a simultaneous change at the same moment, not an escalation of the vocalization pattern that had been building across the session, but a cessation. The structured infrasound communication that had been running continuously since the session began stopped at 51 minutes with a completeness that the audio specialist's field notes describe as more significant than any vocalization the sensors had recorded. Silence in this context was not the absence of activity. It was a specific communication. Something had decided the distance was no longer necessary. The thermal profile of what the cameras documented at close range at 51 minutes is the element of the footage that has been described by every person who has reviewed it with the most careful and the most consistent language. It is large. Larger than the team, larger than the prior season's thermal documentation had established as the upper range of the subject's documented size profile. Its heat distribution is consistent with a large warm-blooded organism whose core temperature and peripheral thermal radiation pattern are unlike any known species in the reference database the production's thermal imaging specialist had consulted across the prior seasons. And it was stationary, not moving toward the team, not moving away, standing between the team's position and the tree line in a stillness that the prior encounter footage had never documented in a subject at this proximity. The stillness of something that had reached the distance it intended to reach and was occupying it with a patience and a deliberateness that communicated more clearly than any behavior the prior investigation record contained what its purpose at that distance was. The Expedition Bigfoot team's response to what the cameras documented at 51 minutes into the night session is captured in the footage with an intimacy that the production's camera deployment, multiple units covering the team's position as well as the approach corridor, makes unusually comprehensive. The initial response of every team member in the frame at the 51-minute mark is consistent across every independent account of the session that has surfaced. A simultaneous shift in the quality of attention that the team was directing toward the investigation that preceded any verbal communication about what the data was showing. The people in that footage did not look at an instrument reading and then react. They were already reacting before anyone had said anything about what the instrument showed. Whatever the thermal cameras documented at 51 minutes at close range was not only visible in the camera data, it was present in the environment of the investigation area in a way that the team members closest to the primary approach corridor were registering through senses that the instrument data was only confirming. Dr. Mayer's response is the most analytically significant element of the team's documented behavior during the relevant period, not because it is the most dramatically visible, but because her professional background gives it the most evidential weight. A primatologist with field research experience across multiple continents, whose professional career has required sustained close proximity to large primate species in their natural environments, responding to what was present in the investigation area at 51 minutes with the specific quality of physical stillness that the cameras document, is communicating something about the nature of what was there that her decades of professional experience with known primate species had not produced in any prior field context. The decision to end the session was not made through the standard production protocol of a director communicating an editorial decision to the team. It was made by the team simultaneously, and without the verbal coordination that group decisions normally require. Every account of the decision that has surfaced describes it the same way. Not a decision that was reached, but a decision that was already made before anyone articulated it. The equipment was packed in a sequence whose efficiency communicated the team's collective understanding that the pace of the departure was not negotiable. The cameras kept rolling through the packing process and through the team's movement out of the investigation area. What they captured in the frames between the departure decision and the moment the team reached the vehicles is the element of the footage that has been described by people who have reviewed it as the most significant evidence the session produced, because in those frames, what had been standing between the team and the tree line at 51 minutes was still there. The body of evidence produced by the Expedition Bigfoot investigation session before the team's departure represents the most comprehensive simultaneous documentation of large unknown primate activity in the history of organized Bigfoot field research. And it is comprehensive precisely because the methodology the production had developed across its prior seasons was running at full deployment capacity when the subject closed the distance at 51 minutes. The thermal imaging data from the session establishes a heat signature profile for the subject that the production's thermal imaging specialist has described in the technical documentation as outside every reference category in the database while being internally consistent. The same profile, the same heat distribution pattern, the same dimensional characteristics across every camera angle and every frame of the relevant sequence. The consistency of the profile across independent camera units eliminates every artifact and equipment anomaly explanation for what the cameras documented. The acoustic data from the session establishes a vocalization record whose frequency analysis is consistent with the prior research literature's findings on Bigfoot acoustic evidence, a vocal production capability exceeding the range of any known North American animal, carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization, and organized with the internal structure that the prior acoustic research identified as communication rather than incidental sound production. The track evidence documented in the primary approach corridor establishes a physical record of the subject's movement toward the team's position that is consistent across every forensic measure the documentation equipment applied to it. The dermal ridge detail in the freshest impressions confirms biological production. The pressure distribution analysis confirms the mass and the locomotion pattern the thermal data independently establishes, and the stride pattern analysis confirms the directional movement the acoustic data tracked across the first 40 minutes of the session. 3 independent evidence streams, thermal, acoustic, and physical, all documenting the same subject in the same location across the same time period, producing results that are mutually consistent and that none of the conventional explanations available for any individual stream can account for when applied to the full body of evidence the session generated. This is the evidential standard that the Bigfoot research community has been working toward across decades of organized field investigation. The Expedition Bigfoot session produced it, and what the team encountered at 51 minutes when the subject closed the distance is the reason the footage from that session is the most significant thing the show has ever captured. The Expedition Bigfoot session footage was presented to a carefully selected group of researchers whose backgrounds in relevant disciplines, thermal imaging analysis, acoustic research, primate biology, and forensic track analysis, gave them the technical framework to engage with the evidence in each of its categories with professional rigor. The selection process was designed to exclude researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would have given either their positive or negative assessments a credibility problem in the broader research community. What was wanted was not validation from committed believers or dismissal from committed skeptics. What was wanted was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior public record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The thermal imaging analysis conducted by the specialist engaged for that review produced findings whose specific language, carefully chosen by a professional who understood the implications of every word, established that the footage was authentic, that the heat signature documented in the relevant sequence had no conventional explanation in the thermal imaging reference literature, and that the profile characteristics of the signature were inconsistent with every known species in every database the analyst had access to. The acoustic analysis produced findings consistent with the prior research literature on Bigfoot vocalizations, while exceeding the evidential quality of every prior acoustic sample in that literature in terms of recording clarity, frequency resolution, and the comprehensiveness of the concurrent documentation that allowed the vocalizations to be analyzed in the context of the full investigation data rather than as isolated recordings. The track analysis produced the most conservative characterization of the three. Forensic track analysts are professionally trained to resist conclusions that exceed the evidence, and the analyst engaged for this review applied that training consistently. What they would say was that the impressions documented in the primary approach corridor were consistent with a large bipedal primate whose foot morphology did not match any known species, and whose mass and locomotion pattern the pressure distribution analysis established at levels inconsistent with human production. What they would not say was what species had produced them. That restraint is itself the most scientifically honest response available to the evidence. And it is more significant, coming from a forensic professional applying rigorous methodology, than any unqualified confirmation would have been. Expedition Bigfoot went further than any prior investigation. The prior seasons built the methodology. This session used it. What came out of the dark to meet the team at 51 minutes is on camera. The question the show has been asking since season 1 has an answer. It came to them.